passive characters are generally frowned upon. More often than not, you've probably been told how to avoid writing one, that they'll ruin your story, that no one will be able to relate to them. And doubtless you've seen a number of poorly written characters criticized largely for being passive. But what about passive characters that are actually done well? So a long time ago, I heard some secondhand advice on how to determine a passive character from an active one. It recommended finding the line between character action and reaction, positing that a passive character is one who simply reacts. Emmy and I discussed this idea and found that it was ultimately rather vague and unhelpful. After all, the line between action and reaction can be a surprisingly hard one to draw. Imagine you have your classic hero and villain, and while the villain plots and schemes, the hero decides not to wait for whatever it is they're planning and instead bring the fight to them. You'd probably say that this is an example of a character taking action, but it can also be argued that the hero is simply reacting to the threat of the villain. Perhaps I'm overthinking it, and if this advice works for you, that's awesome. But I feel this principle makes it far too easy to muddy the waters. And the reality is that you can learn just as much from how a character reacts as you can from how they act. Not to mention, passive characters are much more prominent than you might expect. The everyman archetype from the classic hero's journey always starts out passive. Adventure comes knocking on their door, they refuse the call, get sucked in anyway, and become a mostly passive observer while they're introduced to this entirely new world. Of course, once these characters find their footing, they don't stay passive. But what about the ones who do? Let's take a look at two different examples of what I've dubbed the actively passive archetype, though you might know them better by the description of characteristically passive or the reluctant hero. These characters have already been navigating their crazy world for a while now and are actively trying to avoid being sucked into the main plot. They just want to remain a passive observer, a neutral party. In the case of Geralt from the Netflix series The Witcher, he's fully immersed himself in the solitary life of a witcher, making a point of avoiding overly involving himself with people, politics, or other such complicated issues. Little does he know that the plot is set on mercilessly hunting him. It all starts with Stregobor attempting to hire him, then Renfri trying to recruit him. And even though he turns them both down and suggests a more peaceful alternative to the conflict brewing between the twisted wizard and former princess, his newfound feelings for Renfri push him into getting involved anyway, leading to him regretfully killing one and being driven away by the other. Enter Jaskier, the comedic relief and bisexual icon, who'll be acting as Geralt's foil and anchor to the plot. In episode 2, he tails our titular witcher as he takes on what seems like a minor job, only to end up dragged into a pretty significant political conflict between elves and humans. Geralt and Jaskier are kidnapped by the Elf King, who Geralt points toward a brighter future. While not entirely successful in swaying the king, he's at least able to save his own skin as well as Jaskier's. In the next episode, while undertaking a new job, Geralt meets a significant character, Triss Merigold. He discovers the curse behind the monster he's hunting, lifts it with considerable difficulty, and heads on his way. In the episode after that, Jaskier ends up dragging Geralt to a betrothal feast for the Princess Pavetta, another significant character. A fight breaks out, and in trying to help resolve the conflict, Geralt unintentionally intertwines his destiny with a yet-to-be-born Princess Cirilla, which will eventually put him at the very heart of the story's overarching conflict. In episode 5, while Geralt is searching for a djinn, Jaskier shows his face once more, ready to boot Geralt headfirst straight back into the plot. Geralt unintentionally uses the djinn against Jaskier, prompting him to dive into a frenzied search for a healer, which puts him on a collision course with one of the Witcher's other protagonists, Yennefer of Vengerberg. And you should be able to see the pattern pretty clearly now. While Geralt does take on a more active role starting from the Season 1 finale, you can still see this pattern presenting itself even well into Season 3. At the end of Volume 1 / beginning of Volume 2, 2, he and Yennefer unexpectedly have to deal with the results of a coup in progress. And even by this point, Geralt still chooses the role of passive observer.
And what of you, Witcher? What is your stake? Are you part of this insanity?
I'm not. I don't give a shit about brotherhood politics.
Geralt is most in his element whenever he's sitting on the sidelines, casually throwing in his 2 cents. Or else just defending against whatever immediate threat presents itself. Now on to Saiki from The Disastrous Life of Saiki K, which, by the way, is genuinely one of the greatest comedies I have ever seen. So if you haven't watched the series, I would highly recommend it. Kusuo Saiki is a psychic with quite the impressive range of abilities under his belt. But despite that, or rather because of that, he goes through life desperately trying to avoid drawing any attention his way, attempting to pass himself off as a most unremarkable high school student. Unfortunately for Saiki, however, he is positively surrounded by colorful characters who aren't in the least bit put off by his aloof and dismissive demeanor. So throughout the series, he spends his time trying his hardest to avoid being swept up in their antics and failing miserably. So now that I've laid out my examples, let's circle back to what I said earlier about how you can learn just as much from a character's reactions as you can from their actions. So what do we learn about Geralt and Saiki when looking through this lens? In episode 1 of The Witcher, there is a heartbreaking scene where Geralt recounts a moment where he rescued a woman from assault, only for her to react in sheer horror at the sight of him. This tells us why Geralt chooses not to involve himself with other people. How can he when everyone sees him as a monster? And yet when Renfri ultimately decides to pursue her grudge against Stregobor, even at the cost of an entire town of innocents, how does Geralt react? He tries to help, even though it leads to him killing Renfri, someone he had come to care for, even though the townsfolk turn against him soon thereafter, branding him as the Butcher of Blaviken. He's resoundingly reminded of why he doesn't involve himself with other people's affairs. And yet, what does he do after this? He goes above and beyond what is required of him, trying to persuade the Elf King to choose a better future for his people even after being kidnapped by him, risking his own life to break the curse on a young princess when his job only required that he kill her, throwing himself into a fight to help a complete stranger after being dragged to a party by a troublesome friend, and so on and so forth. As much as Geralt wishes he could take the easy way out and avoid the inevitable pain of rejection, the fact is, he can't help but care. That's who Geralt is, the kind and compassionate Witcher who never hesitates to get involved when it really matters. So what about Saiki? Well, before we even see him on screen, Saiki's first act is to save a little dog from being hit by a vehicle. And this act of interfering for the benefit of another very quickly becomes a trend. Saiki interferes with an argument between his parents in order to force them to see how much they actually care for each other. And we learn that even as a baby, he would run errands for them without their even asking. But in the climax of the episode, when Saiki senses an incoming disaster, he reacts by quietly leaving the room, seemingly abandoning his classmates to deal with the threat of a loose snake. However, he does decide to use his psychic abilities to keep an eye on things from the safety of another room. When faced with the snake, one of his classmates, Kaido, places himself in harm's way in order to protect the other students. And Saiki, admiring his bravery, decides to interfere in a way that both neutralizes the snake and makes Kaido look like a hero. In episode 2, we learn that when Saiki was a child, he would heal his playmates whenever they injured themselves on the playground. But after realizing that this ability was unintentionally frightening people, instead of just not using it and leaving the other children's wounds to heal on their own, he used mind control on the entire planet to make people believe that rapid healing was natural, just so he could keep using his abilities to ensure that people didn't have to remain injured or in pain. As with Geralt, Saiki's impulse to help anyone in need can severely backfire. In episode 3, after mistakenly thinking that a magician is about to get themselves killed performing a dangerous escape, Saiki has to use all manner of tricks to avoid being stabbed, flamed, and crushed. After such an experience, it'd be completely understandable if he no longer felt the urge to jump into another person's rescue. But he does. Over and over and over again. Because just like Geralt, he can't help but care. It's who Saiki is. And honestly, I just find it so fascinating that these two characters, despite coming from wildly different shows, are so alike at their core. But getting back to the question of active versus passive, I'm sure it could be argued to an extent that the characters I've listed here aren't truly passive. That passive characters are defined by their failure to drive the plot forward. So, fair enough. If the numerous examples of how Geralt and Saiki are dragged kicking and screaming along by the plot are not enough to convince you, then allow me to present you with a surprise third example of a well-written passive character. This character is none other than Eleanor Dashwood from Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Virtually nothing Eleanor does has any impact on the plot. She is undeniably a passenger in her own story, forced to silently endure the twists and turns of her tale. Yet she remains an excellent character at the center of a timeless story. Someone whose pain we can share and whose unspoken wishes we can root for to come true. In the article Seeking versus Suffering, The Secret of Passive Protagonists by Donald Mass, it says, "It is entirely possible that a main character can begin a story in a state of suspension. Naturally, there is no story without a response to an adverse situation. But does that mean a fistfight? Must a protagonist formulate a goal or ask me, engage in the more useful business of task, plan, scheme, or gamble? Isn't it enough for a main character to observe, experience, chafe, resist? Can't a protagonist give voice to the powerless? Can't a character just yearn? Can't a story be built of retreat, running, seeking refuge, healing? Is courage necessarily violent? Isn't it equally dramatic to endure? Where is the line between passive as strong, admirable, and uplifting, and passive as weak, degrading, and pathetic? There is a line. It has nothing to do with a character's circumstances and everything to do with a character's spirit. This is where passive dissociates itself from the common, pejorative, unhelpful associations of the word. For fiction writers, a passive protagonist doesn't have a commanding position in the story world, but does have an inner light that says that this character is alive, aware, unbroken, strong inside, and seeing. A passive protagonist might be helpless, but is not hopeless. A passive protagonist may not be marching toward battle, but nevertheless is on a journey to someplace better. That shows first of all in such a character's outlook. When a passive protagonist exhibits humor, quiet strength, resilience, firm judgment, a sense of irony, keen insight, or in any other way witnesses for us in a manner more piercing than we can ourselves manage, then we have reason to care about, believe in, and hope for that person. We admire humans who are curious, sharp, honest, funny, or in any other way better at getting through bad situations than we are. Passive protagonists, when they work, have hidden strengths. I think that quote perfectly captures the heart of passive characters, which makes it all the more disappointing that so many people out there think writing such characters should be avoided at all costs. Obviously, there are a certain set of challenges to writing a passive protagonist well, and they're simply not going to be suited to just any story. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't risk writing such characters at all. Rather, as opposed to worrying about whether a character is being proactive or reactive, we should ask ourselves instead, what does this action or reaction say about the character? And is it effectively communicating what I want/need it to? In truth, you will never find a character who is wholly active or passive, regardless of how you choose to define and differentiate the two categories. As Catherine Cowley says in her article on how to use passive characters effectively, there is no true dichotomy between active and passive characters, but rather it is a spectrum, and many characters shift to different points of the spectrum throughout the course of the story. And that's a good thing. If you stop to think about it, for anyone to try to cut out all moments of passivity in a character would yield some very uncompelling results. Not just for the reason I mentioned earlier, that most protagonists start out passive before shifting to a more active role, but that there are so many moments throughout a story, both big and small, where a character is required to react. By removing that, you'd lose all scenes of dialogue, any chance to show how a dramatic reveal or event impacts a character, and so on and so forth. In reality, this seemingly ever-present push against passivity in characters is incredibly restrictive. Seriously, how many writers out there have started writing a Geralt or a Saiki, only to replace that character with someone more typically gung-ho because they felt their protagonist might be too passive? I know I nearly did. When the reluctant hero I'd crafted at the center of my fantasy series started to feel a little lackluster, I was advised to make him a more active protagonist. For a time, I actually seriously considered scrapping the entire story. But in truth, the problem wasn't so much that my protagonist needed to be more active, but simply that he needed help carrying the story I'd placed on his shoulders. I needed a Yennefer to my Geralt, a Marianne to my Eleanor. If I'd simply erased him and inserted a more proactive character in his place, the story I'd wanted to tell probably would have been completely lost. And cases like this just make it all the more frustrating when people are so quick to equate passive with problem, even when that's not the case. If I may briefly backtrack to the beginning of this video, you may recall the clip I included of Jyn Erso from Rogue One when I mentioned characters who were criticized for being passive. To be completely transparent, I actually included it as a bit of a bait and switch. Yes, I have heard Jyn's fundamental flaw be described as being too passive. But in all honesty, I feel like this is a misdiagnosis of the true root of the issue. Jyn's failing is not that she's passive, but that her motivation is weak. Her primary motivation revolves around her father, who she is barely given a few minutes of screen time with, and that is why she feels uncompelling. In truth, her passive nature in the beginning makes perfect sense. She lost the people she cared about because they were so intent on fighting the Empire. So why would she want to get involved in that same fight? Now, I know people like to conflate passivity with weak motivations, but the two aren't so interchangeable as some might think. As some examples, Ahsoka Tano from the Clone Wars and Samantha Carter from Stargate SG-1 are perfect illustrations of how you can have an active character with incredibly weak motivations. By the way, if you want to check out my video on Samantha Carter, I will have it linked in the description. But back to Jyn, in truth, if her motivations hadn't been bungled, I probably could have included her in my list of well-written, actively passive characters. As it was, I initially struggled to think of any examples for this video. So before I wrap up this video with a few honorable mentions and writing tips, if there's a passive character you personally enjoy who I happen to overlook, be sure to tell me all about them in the comments below. For our first honorable mention, we have Anzu from Romantic Killer, another fantastic anime comedy, which if you haven't seen it, you absolutely should. The reason I didn't include Anzu in my main list is because I felt she and Saiki, both their characters and stories, were much too similar to justify including them both. So as a quick summary, Anzu is another actively passive archetype, always trying to avoid getting dragged into the romantic shenanigans of an otherworldly sprite intent on bringing love into her life. For the second honorable mention, my sister actually suggested I include Cinderella from the 1950 animated Disney film. She is a poster child for passive endurance. The fact that she does nothing to try to escape her situation is believable given the years of abuse that have conditioned her. But she doesn't allow that abuse to crush her spirit, and still finds ways to create space for herself in an environment that actively tries to squeeze her out. And speaking of a poster child for passive endurance, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up Sarah Crew from A Little Princess. Despite the powerless position she is placed in through being a destitute child, she still manages to thrive by creating a refuge through her vivid imagination and sharing it with others. And for my final honorable mention, I have Vander from Arcane Season 1, who I didn't include in the main list since he has a rather limited presence, and I wanted to focus specifically on passive protagonists for this video. Vander, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. His passive nature is the whole point of his character. He refuses to choose violence. So when enforcers come to stir things up, he does nothing. When the people of Zon start pushing for action and call him weak to his face, he does nothing. He only chooses violent action in the few short minutes before his death, and it's only for the sake of his adopted daughter Vi. But speaking of Vander, let me lay out a few tips I thought of for writing passive characters. My first point has to do with establishing the character's headspace, the reason why they are passive in the first place. This can be shown through explicitly or implicitly established backstory, or else something the character is presently living through. With characters like Vander, we see this reasoning presented through their explicitly shown backstory. The devastation and loss that Vander helped bring about through his push to fight in the past is what caused him to abhor the choice of violence. Meanwhile, with characters like Geralt and Saiki, their reasons for choosing passivity are clearly shown through their present living situation, like how Geralt is villainized despite trying to help people, or the dangerous mishaps Saiki experiences with his own powers. Offering this solid understanding of why the characters are the way they are can help build rapport between said characters and your audience. My second point has to do with stakes. In their article on writing passive characters, September C. Fox recommends having high stakes, but having low stakes can work too, since it's more about pressuring the protagonist to act, and depending on their characterization, it doesn't need to be grandiose. It just needs to be motivating on a deeply personal level. So in typically low stakes genres, such as slice of life, romance, comedy, etc., we can see examples of actively passive protagonists in characters like Anzu, Saiki, or Komi from Komi Can't Communicate. Another fantastic anime, by the way. Lastly, my third point has to do with what I mentioned earlier about having a secondary protagonist to help your passive protagonist shoulder their story. As I noted, both Geralt and Eleanor have this assistance, and even Saiki has a whole cast of very colorful characters to support him. But there is a risk with this option. If the deuteragonist is not strengthening the story in as many respects as possible, if they're not enhancing the plot and themes, if they're not balancing and/or highlighting the key characteristics of your central protagonist, then they risk being nothing more than a clunky, forced addition or a substitute protagonist. By which I mean, you don't want the colorful and proactive deuteragonist to overshadow or steamroll your protagonist. The main protagonist should still be compelling enough on their own. They should still be making their own decisions, even if those decisions are to do nothing. If your deuteragonist is detracting from any of the aforementioned aspects, then you probably need to rework the character, or else consider other options for building up your main protagonist. Though, to be clear, you should avoid viewing your deuteragonist as just a function for the story, but rather remember that they also need to be treated as a fully realized character. Because both protagonist and deuteragonist will be inextricably intertwined with each other's stories, it's important for them to have equal footing, so they can better complement each other for the benefit of the story. And with that, this video has reached its end. The only thing left is your input. So be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you agree that the stigma surrounding passivity in characters is ultimately unhelpful and restrictive? Have you ever tried writing a largely passive protagonist? Do you have any tips of your own for writing passive characters? If you do, be sure to share them below so we can keep making this challenge that much less daunting for our fellow writers. And while you're at it, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and share it around. Also, hit the subscribe button to stay tuned for future content. And if you're looking for more ways to show your support, you can do so via Super Thanks or Patreon, which will be linked in the description. As always, massive thanks to those of you who are already patrons. Your support is hugely appreciated. Don't forget to stay loud and proud, folks. I'm your alibi, and I will see you next time. Somebody stole my sunblock. Where am I? So now that I've laid out my examples... It's ridiculous. Stupid sun. As long as that literally didn't change anything. Okay, I'm still standing back here. I don't know why. No, screw it. I'm just gonna stand all the way back here. That's... I've been doing this all day. I got distracted by the delivery truck. What is that doing there? And now I completely forgot the sentence. Huzzah! Did you guys notice all the space? I no longer have to fight to get in here and out. I can just move around, and it's wonderful. It's very nice.